the midst of the sophisticated consumer era. There is so much information at our fingertips. With all this information, we have consumers are actually acting as watchdogs. We have consumers that are doing their own product reviews, and they are incredibly powerful. And so what this means is that brands have less and less control over the conversation about them. And I think we all can probably agree that there is no shortage of food trends to talk about. We have left sriracha and pretzel buns in the past, and we are swimming in a sea of gluten-free locavores who are making really healthy kid meals, probably in their crock pots. And so, the question is how do journalists then weed through all of this sea of information and find the content that consumers really want? And so this is what we want to try and shed some light on here today. And we have an incredible panel of probably some of the most followed food and beverage journalists here today. And while you have their little more detail in their bios in front of you, I'm just going to give them a very quick introduction and get started with some juicy questions. So first we have Lilian Huang Wu, who you can see on Fox News and hear on Fox News on her podcasts. And she talks about everything from Oscar-worthy recipes to seasonal cocktails, and she really seems to have a sixth sense when it comes to what consumers want to hear about. And next to her is Charles Passy, who's an award-winning journalist with Market Watch, and I call him the secret revealer. He talks about lots of inside scoop. He talks about the most intriguing, the most sophisticated, or everything alcoholic you want to know in his Weekend Sip segment, which is one of my favorites. And next to him is Ed Levine. And Ed has his site, Serious Eats. Ed is a bit of a walking encyclopedia, I'd say, of all things food. And if you don't get his newsletter yet, Serious Eats, you have to sign up for it. It's fabulous. And it's free, that's right. So what I wanted to first start off with each of you, maybe starting with Lilian, is to ask, what inspires you?
Well, not just with food, but I think with any journalist, something that is very exciting is when you see someone doing something really important that no one knows about, that they're just doing without expecting recognition. For instance, there was this company out west which rescued dogs and paired these rescue dogs with rescue workers and sent them out here, and they didn't know what they were doing. They had a dinky little website, and then once you gave them a little publicity, all these donations started coming in. So it's really rewarding to find someone doing something like Ed, one of these. This is one of, it's his second book ever. I have the first also. He was running around New York City, finding these cool little places that had been around for generations and, writing basically love notes to them. And I would, like a crazy person, I'd be in Coney Island looking for some candy store that he wrote about. That was really cool. No, it was closed. I was dragging my kids all over Coney Island. Not all. No, the Arthur Avenue ones aren't. And I'd be like, no, it's got to be here. And then my husband would be like, okay, it's been half an hour. And then we get there, and sadly it was this empty lot. So what's so cool is that now he is doing great. But I was reading the book I was calling it the Bible, and I was telling everybody I met who loved food, you got to get this book because it just kind of like takes you through New York City, and these places may not be there much longer, so you have to read it. So it's really rewarding when you find a story, in which case the journalist was story, and getting recognition. Bill Telepan's another guy, kind of like one of the more quiet chefs, doesn't have his own show, but doing things that were really cool with schools. He's pairing now chefs coming out of the CIA with city schools, and going into their, pantries and throwing out all these, disgusting things and making everything better. So, and he wasn't getting a ton of recognition. But then I went to this panel with Colicchio, and I asked him who his heroes were, and he mentioned him. So that's very inspiring to me. Seeing someone doing something they love, not expecting anything, and then, having a happy outcome.
Well, I think I'll I'll sort of take it from two levels. I mean, what inspires me, or what inspires me to write a story is, I mean, there's sort of a cliche about journalism, but trends come in threes. So when you see something happening 3 times, you can write about it. I mean, but you know, there's that feeling that something is in the air. I mean, I'll just tell you like 2 food stories that I'm in the kind of in the sort of are in the beginning stages right now. I mean, these are not necessarily big stories. I'll probably do a slideshow on unusual fast food and fast casual restaurants, unusual examples of these restaurants doing breakfast. I mean, this came about because somebody told me that Jersey Mike Subs is doing breakfast, and then I got a pitch for another chain doing breakfast, and then somebody told me I've got to check this out, that Shake Shack is right, yeah. So you know, so when you hear this, you think, well, that's goofy enough, and then you know, frankly, you hope you are, if not the first one, the early ones to write about this trend. I mean, there's been, you know, some of this got written about when Taco Bell started doing breakfast, but I mean, you know, you hope you're going to be a little bit ahead of the curve, you know. And then I finally went. Another example of a story is I finally went. This may be only 2 examples, but it makes me still kind of think there's something there. I went to an event in New York about a month ago called. I'm going to mispronounce it. Cochon. It's essentially an event that celebrates heritage breed pigs. You know, and I had remembered I had gone to a dinner about a year ago. I mean, not that these are exactly new, but I remember I had gone to a dinner sort of lauding some kind of Southern chef who was in town, and they had him prepare a meal. And I remember they used a heritage breed pig that, frankly, you know, was so delicious, but it actually tasted like beef. I mean, it was such a unique flavor. And then I remembered kind of the southern pigs, the Spanish pigs I've had, the jamon. So I suddenly said, but in my mind, what made an editor perk up is I said, you know, we need to do a story called My Pig is Better Than Your Pig. Because now it's kind of become this game of one-upmanship that, you know, oh, we don't just serve, you know, quality, you know, we don't just serve organic or local, but look at the breed, and, you know, and suddenly, oh, do you have that breed, or, you know. But you can kind of see this sort of buzzing in the restaurant world. You know, I would say another thing that inspires me is, I mean, I have a broad enough platform in that I can write stories, I can do slideshows, and I can do columns, opinion pieces. So a few weeks ago, the Girl Scouts announced that they were expanding their gluten-free. They were expanding. Basically, they were offering cookies that were gluten-free. They had test marketed it last year. This year, they were doing it, and I'll be honest, to me, that was basically a sign that gluten-free has jumped the shark. And I wrote a particularly strongly worded column saying enough is enough. Now, I got, and I expected I would, you write these columns in a certain way, knowing you're going to, you know, get some feathers ruffled, but that's okay. Yeah, obviously there are people who have, you know, some medical needs who depend on gluten-free, and yes, a Girl Scout gluten-free cookie would mean something to them. But really what I was trying to say is that, you know, food companies have jumped on this bandwagon. There's a lot of evidence that supports the idea that eating gluten-free, if you don't have to, is not only nonsensical, it actually could be bad for your health, because so many of these gluten-free products end up, you know, upping the sugar or other things. You know, and you know, at a certain point, you're just, you know, I'm sort of saying, consumers are just trend followers now. Companies are just trend followers, and you know, so many people have gotten on this bandwagon that its moment is past. And I interviewed experts who said, you know, yes, we're already moving on to the GMO-free, you know, sort of will be the new thing. So, you know, so those are the kind of things that, you know, that I look for and what I cover, and kind of what I see in the marketplace that kind of just perks my ears.
You know, what inspires me is what you said, is I'm looking for great food being made by people who aren't used to getting recognition. That was the reason I wrote New York Eats in 1991, and here we are, you know, 24 years later, and I started a website that was basically dedicated to that proposition. which is find people who really care about what they're doing and have it be good. So, because a great story in and of itself is somewhat inspirational, but a great story that's connected to great food is really inspirational. And what's interesting from my point of view is, like, we have 10 million unique visitors a month, so it's a pretty significant audience that we're dealing with. And what's gratifying to me as a journalist is that they're interested in the same connections and the same stories that I turn out to be interested in. It's a really, I don't know if it's serendipity or whether luck is the residue of design, but somehow that combination of story and serious deliciousness, as I call it, is not only inspiring me as a journalist, but is really inspiring everyone in the food culture. And just, if we just think for a second about how the food culture has developed in the last 25 years. It's like people never cared about where their food came from. They didn't, when I wrote that book in 1991, people thought you needed a visa to go to Brooklyn. Like that was, it was like, wow. Literally, I got someone from the Times food section wrote a story about, and it was like, she called me up and said, I heard you went to Brooklyn. And it's like, yes, I did. There's good food in Brooklyn, and it was all about finding, to your point, the Palestinian woman who made great, zucchini fritters in Bay Ridge. And what's happened is that the food culture is mushroomed so much that there are entire generations of people that they want to feel connected to the food. They love a great story, and they want to know where their food comes from. And that is that hasn't jumped the shark. That is, the shark is still catching up to it. And by the shark, I mean the whole food culture. And so, that's always been what's inspired me. And it's especially inspiring to see that so many millions of people come to Serious Eats for that kind of information.
So, Lillian, you and I were talking earlier about what's old is now new. And we have this conscious consumer who they're curious. They want to know more. Their palate seems to change every day. How does this affect the content that you choose?
Well, it's so much fun for me because I have this broad platform on which to pick and choose. People are very curious about new things. They're willing to, I don't know that they're willing to eat bugs just yet, which is one of the new trends, but they think, the whole nose to tail thing is actually very old. I mean, maybe not in America, but, chicken feet at dim sum, anybody? That's, very in the back there. That's just something that's been around in other countries forever. Bone broth is another huge thing.
Also known as stock.
Right, exactly.
Okay, can we just agree?
Yeah, I'm
I
reading
love
it, I'm
Marco Cadore. He's a great cook. Bone broth is stock.
Right. Yeah, it's just, what else is old?
Stock at $10 a bowl.
So, and the whole, knowing your farmer, I mean, that's what our grandparents did. They didn't have a choice. They didn't have Whole Foods down the street. So all that is being rediscovered. People are also taking old dishes like comfort foods and elevating them. So you have your mac and cheese with lobster, mac and cheese with truffle. So they want to take what they know and make it a little more special. So yeah, it's just kind of what sounds like it's new, but it's kind of a retread. But people are jumping in and very excited about it, and they're spending money on it. So I think it's because everyone, there's a hobbyist movement. Everybody cooks these days. Everybody's a chef. Everybody's a critic. And, Yelp and all these websites let them.
And has has the consumer interest in social and health responsibility changed how you report?
Yeah, I mean, you give them, you talk to experts, but you're not saying, well, this is definitely going to, fix your liver after 30 years of drinking. But there, you try to put as much information out there. A few years ago, I went to a food show, and they were telling me the latest new thing was goji berries. And I was like, oh, I wonder what it is. And I see this thing, and they showed it to me, and I tasted it. And I was like, this is the stuff that my parents have been like trying to have me choke down throughout my entire childhood. It's this thing that's used in chicken stew, Chinese chicken stew. So all these cultures are kind of having their turn in the spotlight now, that Americans are much more willing to try things from other countries.
So Charles, I was hoping maybe you could share with us some of the best practices that you've seen from food and beverage companies when they think about social health and environmental responsibility through their business strategies, and maybe you'd even share some of the worst.
Well, I mean, best practices. Some of this is not necessarily based on reporting. Some of this is based on life experience. I mean, I think that in general, consumers have benefited from what I would call transparency. I think of it in two ways. The food ingredient labeling with allergens. I mean, I have a son. I mean, he's now all grown up, but who is deathly allergic to peanuts, milk, and tree nuts. 20 years ago, we used to just live in fear of food. It was a real challenge for us. I mean, I have written about this, and he's actually written about it. Suddenly now, and you would see things like natural flavors, and it would just drive you crazy because there was no way of knowing whether that could include milk or peanuts or these other things. So I think the transparency with that has helped a lot. I think the calorie counts, at least in restaurants in New York, I've seen it in other cities, although I don't think it's mandated in other cities. I think that is something that is just, I think it's great. I mean, I think it's great that people actually know that, dare I say it, Chipotle's can be pretty bad for you, which is something that the Times had fun with recently, and I had written about before, that a lot of the quote-unquote good-for-you foods or chains or that do that. In terms of worst practices, I mean, I think I gave an example. I mean, I was at the fancy food show. I go to every year. It's the big gourmet expo. I think like 2 years ago when talking about the gluten-free. I mean, you just see companies saying like, we're marketing a new brand of apple and it's gluten-free. I'm like, there never was gluten in that to be. I mean, there's that kind of, I hate to repeat it, but jumping on the bandwagon. I think there's also a fair bit of, people confused. Somebody was talking in the earlier panel about organic and what that means. Well, it's very funny to me. I mean, I had done a story looking at farmers who, the high cost of being a truly organic farmer, and all the rules and codes they have to live by. And then I talked to this other guy who's like, well, I farm in the organic style. And I was like, well, what does that mean exactly? He's like, well, I'm technically not certified organic, but I do everything just like that because it's too expensive to get the certification and all that. But then I realized this is a guy, I mean, he was actually a chef at a restaurant, but he also, a pretty prominent chef, actually, out of the Boston area. And he also does he has his own farm, and he, sells his products through his farm. And I realized, well, I don't think he actually ever, puts organic on it, but basically everybody thinks of him as organic, and I guess you could say he is, but technically he isn't. And that, I mean, I hate to pick on Chipotle, but I think everybody has this notion that Chipotle is this saintly purveyor of things. Well, it's been shown that a lot of their stuff isn't locally sourced. I mean, some of it is, but a lot of it isn't. Some of it isn't organic. So I feel like some of that. I feel like Whole Foods has, look at the name Whole Foods. Everybody thinks, oh my God, everything in there is it. Now that's true. They do very clearly make it within the store. But I think most people, most shoppers, when they're going into a Whole Foods, have this kind of perception that everything is good for them there. And I mean, they sell a lot of conventional produce. I mean, they do market, but I still think that there's kind of a little bit of deception in just the whole way that company sort of positions itself. So, those would be some examples.
So Ed, for you, I want to know a little more about the pervasiveness of social media, the shareable content. How has that changed your content and maybe the consumer appetite for food and beverage news?
Well, for us, we tend to write what we're interested in. I know that could sound elitist, but it's really not. We have a staff of 8 editors who are incredibly passionate about what we do, and our story meetings are, I would say, relatively organized free-for-alls where people are pitching their stories about what they're passionate about. And then, certain stories go viral. And so you say to yourself, me as the founder, I go, okay, yeah, we need to come up with a viral story every week. That's like saying to a stock analyst, we need to come up with, a stock that's going to quadruple in value in a year every week. If I knew how to make a story go viral, then I wouldn't need to be here. It's very simple. So let me just give you a couple of examples of stories that have gone viral. The last story we had, which is probably our most popular story in the history of Serious Eats, and Serious Eats is a little more than 8 years old, and internet years are like dog years, so we're really 56 years old. But Kenji Lopez-Alt, who is one of our columnists, our very popular Food Lab columnist, did a story on myths about cast iron pans. Can you think of anything less sexy and contemporary than myths about cast iron pans? That story was on the front page of Reddit. It still, and it's now 4 months later, it's still always in our top 10 every week. People care. Turns out that a lot of people cared about cast iron pans. Cast iron pans are cheap. They grew up with them. And one of the things that none of us have mentioned that I think is really important, whether you're a packaged food company or a website, is there's a tremendous need for people to feel connected to their food and connected to each other. So what goes into a viral story, it certainly involves something resonating. So Kenji didn't write that piece going, this thing is going to go crazy, it's going to be our most popular post of all time. He said, there's all these myths out there about cast iron pans, and he's an obsessive scientific type, right? He went to MIT, graduated, and broke his parents' heart by telling them he wanted to be a cook. So, but it's actually turned out okay for him. But, and then the second piece that he wrote many years ago that is still cited all over the place is, and it's the other end of the spectrum, was he ate the entire secret menu at In-N-Out Burger. And it was very interesting when Ezra Klein, I don't know if any of you know, Ezra Klein is the founding editor of Vox.com and was at the Washington Post for many years. And when he was interviewed about forming Vox and what he wanted it to become, he actually mentioned the In-N-Out story on Serious Eats. He said, see the story? I refer to this story 8 or 10 times a year, because every time I go to In-N-Out, I want to know. And, so for whatever reason, our it turns out that some of the things that we are passionate about and some of the things that we are enthusiastic about, we share those passions, we share those enthusiasms, you know, and it could be also about a farmer, you know, to your point. You know, farmers are, I think it's great. Like when I wrote that book and there was an entire chapter on farmers markets, that was almost 25 years ago. And now there are certain farmers that are kind of like rock stars, you know, which is, if anyone could be a rock star that, you know, that would deserve it, it would be a farmer. Because it is a truly, truly arduous life that they lead. I've done many stories in print, video, you know, doing a day in the life of a green market farmer. I don't know if any of you, you know, have ever followed this. It's basically a 20-hour day. So I went up and saw a great farmer named Rick Bishop up in the Hudson Valley. He grows amazing tomatoes, strawberries, potatoes, greens. I went up there with my crew. We gathered from the field while it was still daylight. We went to eat dinner, and then we packed the truck, and we left at 3 a.m. He then gets to the market, sets up. The market starts at 9. Some people get there earlier. The chefs get there really early because they want the best stuff. And then they have to be there and civil on no sleep until 6 o'clock, load up the truck, and go back to their farms. If any of us had to do that every day, we'd lose our minds. And they do it. If they don't do it every day, they do it 3 or 4 times a week. And it's because they love it. You know, people say, they see a tomato in the farmer's market and they go, God, this tomato costs $3.50. That is ridiculous. You know, and then you talk to the tomato farmer and you realize that in a good year, the tomato farmer might clear $30,000. You know, might clear, if they cleared $50,000, it would be a wild success. So, you know, for us, we follow our passions, and I'm lucky enough to that our passions are the passions of our audience enough of the time so that we can keep doing what we do.
So in that vein, talking about these deeper stories, we have a room here of food and beverage communicators. What can they do to be better partners for you, to help with the content, to be a part of the content, be a part of this story when it comes to the food itself, the social, health, and environmental responsibility? What can they do for you? It's for all of you.
You know, for us, we do a lot of what's called native content on our site, you know, and some with companies that are represented here, you know, Nestle, Kraft, General Mills. And our thing is, our bottom line is be straight. Don't obfuscate. You know, think of what you want to say that is indisputably true and that will resonate with your target consumer, and then we can build a story around it. The story that we can build, the content that we create, it won't lead with Tide is great, because that's not going to connect to anybody and it's not going to get them to read further. So what context can we place Tide in? So I'll give you an example. We did for Kraft Pourables many years ago, when my hair was still red. We did a video for Kraft Pourables on a day in the life of a green market farmer. And that's when I followed Rick Bishop around. And it became a 6-minute film. And because what they wanted is they wanted the consumer to feel that their salad dressing could go on these amazing greens that Rick Bishop grew. And so you could build a story around that. And an interesting thing about that story is that that film was the only piece of sponsored content that's ever won a James Beard Award. And so the people at Kraft, I think, were astounded. But it sort of supports, which is you start with the truth, you know, and the truth sets everyone free. It sets marketers free. It sets journalists free, you know, and so if you start there, you know, we've had, you know, discussions with the Haagen-Dazs of the world, you know, brands that we genuinely love, and just say, just people see through bull these days. The conscious consumer is a very, very sophisticated consumer. They have been bombarded with messages, so many messages for so long in so many different media that they see through falsehoods. You know, we've been talking about Chipotle. People understand. But you know, for every Chipotle, I don't know how many of you have ever eaten at a Sweet Green. Sweet Green is a fascinating young company, fast casual salad bar, started by 3 or 4 young Georgetown grads, way, did I say way long enough? Way younger than I am. And what's interesting, when you walk into a Sweet Green, there's a list of where everything has been sourced. The carrots are from here, you know, the goat cheese is from here, the turkey is from here, and it's literally everything that's in the store. Now, you know, so what they want to do is they want to hit you over the head that they are connected to the food culture that they're a part of. And so when you walk in there as a consumer, you feel really good because you know where the lettuce came from. And sometimes the lettuce might come from a faraway place, and they say it. And when they can, they source locally. It's hard to source locally on this day in New York City. You know, it's the end of February. But so, you know, that's what we do, and that's what we tell our advertisers that want us to develop content for them, or sometimes they want to develop content for themselves. Start with the truth and go from there. Find the kernel of truth that connects with consumers, and you win.
I mean, I totally agree with Ed, but you know, how you convey that truth is, I mean, I could go on for 2 hours about, you know, how bad is the PR that I see and how it comes to me. But since we have a lot of, you know, major brands here, I'll tell just a very quick story. Very prominent spirits brand, you know, let's just say it's based in Kentucky and got bought out by a Japanese company.
But he can't tell you what it is.
I mean, I could probably tell you, but you know, I mean, you know, they have a zillion different brands and product lines. They hire a major national agency practically for each one, which in turn, you know, has, you know, 14 managers probably working on it. But eventually what happens is some kid right out of college who wants to go into PR is hired, and you know, really doesn't know how to write a press release, doesn't know how to communicate, certainly has no concept of how to build a relationship. And he's suddenly assigned the account. He gets probably some kind of press list and sends a pitch to me, has no idea who I am, has no idea what I write, has not taken any, you know, even 10 minutes to actually figure that out because I'm just a guy on a list. Even whether or not I'm important or not, he hasn't, you know, whatever. And you know, in this case, the pitch happened to be for a product that I was sort of actually interested in, but the pitch was so nonsensical. It wasn't in English. I mean, I know these things usually go up the flagpole and do get approved, but I'm just saying, even if this happened to not be well written. You know, few weeks later, I'm sitting with the vice president of this company, vice president of communications, and it happens to be that this wasn't a planned breakfast. I was actually at a press event, and somebody else hooked me in, and he said, "Oh, you should finally meet this guy." And he kind of asked me, he's like, "How are we doing?" And I was like, "How does that kind of a press?" I told him this example. How does that happen? And he's like, "Oh, well, that's our agency," and he's probably just The point is, most major companies, I think if they actually were very consciously aware of how their PR reaches out, I think they'd be embarrassed. I mean, it is, and I really honestly say I see very few national agencies that do a good job. I mean, what I tend to find is boutique agencies and even like two-person shops that start to have a better relationship with journalists. And honestly, I would say the biggest thing in terms of conveying the truth, it's not just that there's often BS or whatever, or why would we care about that product? Why are you even sending me this pitch? But the biggest thing that I often tell people is, like he says, we're not going to write about your new Tide detergent or your new brand of frozen strudel pastries or whatever. But what I find that almost every PR person these days misses is that we are looking for the broader trend. So, I say, ironically, to pitch your company, you're going to have to pitch me 3 other companies. You're going to have to show me how this is a broader story in the marketplace. And you're going to have to accept that if I write about you, I'll give you an example, because I cover some non-food subjects as well. I just wrote about a company doing SAT preparation for the SATs. The company's come out with a sort of a cheaper platform for how to train, teach students and all that. I mean, they pitched me their company alone, but the pitch was broad enough that I could see that there was a larger trend for cheaper products in this marketplace, and that's what I wrote about. The company ended up getting a prominent mention in that story. I'm sure the company was thrilled, but again, it was the broadness of the topic. Most of what I see is, we've got a brand new frozen strudel that you should write about, and I'm like, well, why the heck should I care? So those are kind of, as I say, the mechanics of how I see PR done is often so lousy at this point. It's very hard for me to kind of separate, the wheat from the chaff. So, there you go.
Luckily, he was not talking about Gibbs RBB. So, Lillian, how about you?
So you got some kid fired. Definitely no commercial, because you have to know what my audience is. I always tell somebody who's pitching me something, well, this is national. So if someone across the country is going to care about something that's happening here in New York, it's got to either be really unique in some way, like the cronut nuttiness, that. Or it's got to be somebody attached to it. For instance, I think Bon Jovi did the restaurant for people who can't afford to pay. So it's got to be, you have to think of it as a news story. KFC just came out with something, or just announced something, I think it was today. They have coffee cups, which are edible. And so that plays into the whole sustainable thing. It's made out of like cookie and non-meltable chocolate. I don't know, that doesn't sound very, not Valrhona. But, so that's a news story that you could see happening, because it's really unique and different. And a lot of people don't think about that. But I think that, having a specific relationship with the person you're trying to pitch helps, because it could be, just some naive kid out of college, but if they've helped you out in a pinch, because sometimes I get last-minute requests for stories like, quick, do something on veterans and how they're getting discounts today. Sometimes they'll be there for me at the last minute and say, like, oh, I have an expert for you. Then you're more likely to get a journalist who's willing to kind of help you out a bit and say, well, maybe this angle works better, or we could include it in, like for Haagen-Dazs, like you could do something on summer, like fun summer things, like what you could do. It wouldn't have to be specifically, Haagen-Dazs, but it could be a picture of their product, or it could be their recipe. Sometimes with cocktails, we did something with Chandon last year that was a lot of fun. They hired Christina Tosi to bake cookies branded with their own champagne, company, and that worked out well. So just, know your audience, try to know your journalist, try to, not be a name on a list, and you'll get a lot more traction. And also, everything is very asset rich these days. So having that, like having videos already shot up, which don't look like commercials, but maybe more like B-roll, are likely to be used. Studies, CarMax did a great study that came out yesterday about how there are recall cars on the road that get resold, and the buyer doesn't know they're recall. So everybody's going to be like, oh my God, I need this report. But it's also a news story because millions of cars are out there on the roads, which possibly could hurt or kill someone. And there's no rule that says you've got to tell somebody that you're selling them a car which has been recalled. So.
Just two quick things I would add, just picking up on something she said, is having one of the things that drives me crazy. So I do a weekly column. It's called Weekend Sip. It's on either I'll pick a bottle of wine, often spirits, beer, whatever. I don't know if you run into this. Is that every image I get from companies is a vertical shot of a bottle, and I'm like, from what I've gathered, horizontals are the way to go. And I'm like, why does everybody send me a vertical shot? Why can't they, at least when they figured this out, and to make it a horizontal, all you need to do is have like a cocktail in front of the bottle, just do something that makes the photo, work. And I'm like, why is it that, and now I'm cycling through this where I've told companies this already, I prefer horizontals. It's almost to the point where sometimes we don't feature something because the art is so bad. The other thing that I would just say as a quick tip, and you'd be surprised how rarely it happens, is to retweet journalists. I think it's common courtesy, but I'm just amazed that when we sometimes write about a company, they don't actually, get the story out there. It's part of. It's not necessarily the one thing that's going to make something go viral, but it's all part of the mix.
And the one thing I would add to this is knowing your journalist is incredibly important. Because sometimes I get probably 100 press releases a day. You guys probably do too, and 95 of them, if my response is, this person had just no idea of what I've been doing with my life for the last 25 years, and so I would just amplify on that point. It's really, really important to know, if you're going to call Ed Levine about a story, know what Ed Levine's interested in. You don't have to read all the books I've written. It doesn't, you could Google me and you'd find out an awful lot. And the second thing I want to, if most of you are communications professionals, is know that we're looking for a story. You're storytellers by definition. That's one of the things that distinguishes public relations and communications from marketing, right? So, we can help you craft a story, but just know that going in, that's what we're interested in. We're interested in the best story. If we can build a great story around your product, that's the win-win. If you and you're trained storytellers, so in theory, it's a wonderful marriage, right? You're storytellers, we're storytellers. Can't we meet in the middle and craft a story that sheds light on issues or your product or whatever? And we find that there are certain agencies that understand this better than others. So.
Good. Well, I will remind all of you, if you're not following Ed, Charles, or Lillian yet, if you look on the tables, we have their handles. Get on board, start retweeting them. And I think now would be a great time. Let's open it up for some questions. Oh, going over here.
Thank you. So my question's about what resources that companies create do you find helpful in terms of storytelling? You talked about Chipotle before. For instance, they don't have a sustainability report. Is that something you make note of when it comes to companies investing their time in storytelling in terms of being responsible, being environmentally conscious? What resources do you look at? Are they third-party certifications, so like a B Corp certification? Is that something that you pay attention to or find helpful, or is it, you know, when you go to Google the company, what is the first thing that comes up?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily, since I don't necessarily write about organic or local just alone, I'm not necessarily looking for that. I mean, so I'm not, I mean, basically, I mean, some of it is common sense. I mean, like I say, having horizontal photos is a huge thing. I mean, in terms of resources, I think that, I mean, a lot of times you go to third-party companies like Technomic or Symphony IRI, I mean, companies that analyze data to kind of see, I mean, so you are looking for that. I mean, sometimes, one of the things that frustrates me a lot as a journalist is, I mean, if it's a private company and they won't release numbers, okay, but can you at least tell me, have sales for this product quadrupled or doubled or whatever? I mean, I'm looking for something, because if you can't give me a dollar figure, can you give me something? Because if you can't, I can't really say what, or can you point me to a source? Like we know Technomic just researched that, and we'll show you that, sales of breakfast sales at fast food restaurants have quadrupled in the last year. I mean, so even if you can't give me a number, can you point to something? Because it's, in the end, you need to prove your thesis, and usually numbers do that. So that's something that I look for. The other thing, frankly, I mean, I don't know if this is to your point or not, is you would be surprised how hard it is on many companies' websites, and I think some of it's intentional, but to find the press contact. And a lot of times it is an email contact, which is fine, but I'd really like to have a phone number. I think they don't put it up there perhaps because they don't want consumers calling, they don't want that kind of thing, but I'm just shocked at how hard it is sometimes to actually meet, a real human being. This is kind of a little bit PR 101, but I mean, also when a journalist calls on deadline, I mean, it's not unusual for me to call somebody at 3 o'clock and say I need an answer by 5. That has to happen. The one company I know that, I can give 2 examples of companies that have done miraculous jobs in doing that. Just yesterday, Disney. Disney is just such a perfectly run company on so many levels, but when you contact their PR department, you're going to get an answer. And even if it's an answer that tells you we don't have an answer, the other one is Costco. I mean, Costco amazes me in that when you contact their PR department, they get you a senior vice president to interview within a half hour. So, I mean, these are just good examples.
Anyone else?
To the point of 95% of the press releases you get are irrelevant, do you think that the press release still has a place in the sun, or would you rather just always get a handcrafted pitch, and should people stop writing press releases, really? I mean,
that's a really, really interesting question, because especially in the world we live in now, I think the value of a press release has definitely gone down. Certainly a press release that's not well written, or that's obviously not something that Serious Eats is going to cover, that's the definition of a bad press release. A relationship, a one-on-one pitch, a truly personal pitch that may not involve a press release can be the most effective way. And again, my editors deal with many more communications professionals than I do, because there's 1,000 stories I want to write today, and there'll always be 1,000 stories that have nothing to do with press releases that are just on my list of stories to write before I pass. But there are a lot of, we use our editors use press people, I think, in the way that you're talking about, not from a press release standpoint, but from a communication. Let's talk. Can you steer me in this direction? What can you do? You know, can you get me to this person? You know, help me craft the story. You know, because usually press releases are filled with so much boilerplate that they've sort of lost their meaning as time goes by. I mean, that's just my personal, I don't know if you share that.
Well, one kind of annoying thing is there's one agency where if you have a relationship with one person, they suddenly pass your email to all 10 of their coworkers, and they start pitching you stories that have nothing to do with what you're working on. But then they sometimes do have access to people that you want to speak with who are kind of, you know, difficult to get a hold of. So there's that. But yeah, I think they're kind of like cold calls. You know, it depends on what your budget is. Every now and then I'll get something and I happen to be working on that, and I'll be like, yeah, okay, that person sounds like a chef I could talk to, so I'll just, you know, add him to the mix. And if he's a good speaker, then no harm done. I happen to need somebody. So every now and then you do get a hit, but it depends on how much you want to throw at it.
All right. Well, great advice. We will take to heart. Is there one more question?
If you have time.
Of course.
So I could say it really loud. We're talking about conscious consumers, you're members of the media. How much do you feel like you shape the conscious consumers' tastes and preferences and inform them versus you also talked about reflection, exactly.
That's another really good question. I think it depends on the story, you know. So, as I say, most of our stories start with a passion or enthusiasm that we hope reflects the public's, you know, concern or interest in something. But I think it's both. It has to be both these days, because you know, we're a little different. Is yes, you look for trends, but if there's a story that only one company is involved with, and it suggests a broader story, it suggests a more global story, a more macro story, then it can, you know, if you look at the Shake Shack, you know, going public and how much ink that generated, you know, that was because the public seems to have, at the moment, an inexhaustible or unquenchable appetite for Shake Shack-related information and burger-related information. That's the reality, you know. I have written an entire book on pizza. I will tell you the same thing is true of pizza, you know, because even the worst slice of pizza is still melted cheese on warm bread, you know, and we can't seem to write enough about pizza or burgers or cast iron pans, as it turns out. But it's a very good question because it gets to the heart of what we all do, you know, and it is a combination by definition, I think.
One more? Last one.
I have a question on how, if at all, you've been affected by the unconscious consumers that are Yelpers, and how their opinions, which are, in my biased opinion, have no truth behind them, how that's affected what you guys do as journalists.
I just have a funny aside because, you know, in choosing a restaurant that we visited over the weekend, you know, my wife pointed out, she said, look at the Yelp, you know, a couple of people said they got food poisoning. I said, there is not a restaurant on the planet at this point that there's not a Yelp review that says, I've gotten food poisoning. So I said, I tune it out, but I don't know if that's not really an answer to your question, but I find it hilarious, though, on certain levels.
Yeah, we tend, we're not that, we're not affected by Yelp. You know, if Yelpers love a restaurant, if they hate a restaurant, if they've decided that they get everyone gets food poisoning at that restaurant. We understand that Yelp has a place in the culture, and it's a very successful business, but it has almost no effect. No, I would say forget the qualifier. It has no effect on what we cover and how we cover it. Because you can't take anything that's said on Yelp at face value. That's not reporting. You know, that's not even anecdotal. You know, that's like its own kind of semi-truth. You know, so it just doesn't affect what we do. You know, and that's not to say that maybe that's a mistake, but that's just the policy we have. You know, and it's not even a policy, it's just the way we work.
I think Yelp is great because it feeds the passion. Like, it doesn't affect, I would never introduce a chef as, you know, chef so-and-so with 4 stars on Yelp. It's just not. But I think it's all part of the everybody's a critic, everybody's a chef, everybody's out sourcing like the finest ingredient. It just kind of feeds that whole interest and obsession. So I think Yelp is fantastic for what it is, and a lot of it's nonsense. But I think somebody who's going to spend 5 minutes venting about a restaurant or just, you know, swooning over something they just ate and take pictures is going to be more apt to read about cast iron skillets.
Yeah, I mean,
so
it
all
certainly
plays
reflects
off
the
on.
passion people have about food, and the good thing about the internet is, and the bad thing about the internet is that it gives everyone a voice. You know, so it is the definition of small d democracy, right? It's very messy because everyone has a voice. You know, there should be a Yelp voter registration law, you know, in order to qualify to write a Yelp review, but there isn't and there won't be, and so that makes the internet democratic and messy. But I think people use Yelp. The way people choose restaurants now is through their friends, through Yelp, through Foursquare. Then they'll curate. What does Serious Eats say? What does Eaters say? What does the New York Times say? People curate their own restaurant reviews because that's what the internet gives you the ability to do. In 5 minutes, you can find out what 10 sources, some of them are trusted, some of them may not be, think about a restaurant. And that's really exciting. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. You know, I do it. You know, it's like, and I know Pete Wells. It's like, what did Pete say about this restaurant? You know, when I'm thinking about, if we haven't reviewed, and we've sort of stopped doing restaurant reviews for other reasons, but you know, it's part of the world we live in. You can't ignore it. On the other hand, you know, if you live and die by Yelp, you'll really lose your mind. You know, that's what I would say.
Well, thank you, all three. It was great insights into transparency, trends, and horizontal images. And so, thank you all. A little round of applause. And I'm going to turn this back to Jeff Alteid, who's going to introduce our fabulous next special speaker.